Welcome to Film 5D, the show about everything film with the A7S III. I'm Aaron Hammock, and today I'll be comparing the 50mm G-Master 1.2 lens to the Sony Zeiss 1.8 55mm. Is it worth the upgrade? Let's find out. Now, here in my hands I have the newest G-Master lens from Sony, the 50mm 1.2 prime. This is the most expensive prime I've ever personally owned, and I purchased it with my own money to upgrade from my Zeiss 55mm 1.8 in order to bring you this comparison. So if you enjoy this content, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. At this point, I've upgraded all of my Sony Zeiss lenses to G-Master variants, with the exception of my 90mm macro lens from Sony. This 50mm 1.2 is going to join my other three primes, the 24mm 1.4, the 35mm 1.4, and 85mm 1.4. But if you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering if this lens is worth more than double the price tag of the 55mm Zeiss. And I have some tests for you in a minute that can hopefully help you make that decision. But first, let me just take a minute to talk more about Sony G-Master primes in general and the G-Master lineup in general from Sony. So this lens comes in the typical black and orange box. You get your documentation and warranty. You get a soft zip-up case, which I much prefer versus the leather cases that come with some of the lower tier Sony lenses, which end up peeling over time. You also get a strap for said case, which I never end up using and pretty much just store in the box. You get a lens hood similar to the ones that came with the 35 and 85mm G-Masters, which I really like the simplistic style of. And like other G-Masters, the 50mm 1.2 has a manual aperture ring, weather sealing, and not one but two customizable buttons on the lens itself. It's also the fastest lens that Sony makes for the E-mount. But as we saw with my 85mm and 35mm G-Master reviews recently, links in the description below if you missed those by the way, they do struggle with focus speed and focus breathing. Does the 50mm have those same issues? Well, I did some testing comparing this lens to the 55mm 1.8. Now, unfortunately, I sold my 55mm before I received this lens as it was on back order for the past month. Now, I did my best to match the testing environments, but you will at some times notice slight differences from shot to shot. Having said that, I did my best to use real-world tests and sticking to 4K video for comparisons, so let's jump in. All right, so here we are in the first test. We have the G-Master here with the brick wall to check sharpness and vignetting. These are both at 5.6. Here's the Zeiss. Both pretty similar in terms of sharpness at 5.6. I give a slight edge to the G-Master here in the center, and then the corner, the G-Master is a little bit more significantly sharp than the Zeiss. Here we have at 2.8, still no vignetting with the G-Master. The Zeiss here starts to have a little bit of a vignette, and the center, both still pretty sharp. Edges, again, the G-Master is definitely sharper near the edges. And at 1.8, we start to see a little bit of a vignette with the G-Master, but a significant vignette here with the Zeiss. And at the center, significantly sharper here with the G-Master, as well as the corner again. And then we'll take a look at both of them here. We can see that the 55 Zeiss has a lot more vignetting going on at 1.8. And then just for fun, we're going to look at the G-Master at f1.2. Some vignetting here for sure, but pretty amazing considering that it's at f1.2. And here we are at the center, still really sharp. Edge a little bit softer, but still a very sharp lens. Now let's take a look at a landscape shot. This is with the G-Master at 5.6, and here's the Zeiss at 5.6. Both do pretty well in landscape. I'd say the color rendering of the G-Master is a little bit more true to life, especially when you look at the green in the bushes. And here we are zoomed in at 400% in the middle, and here's the edge. And you can see pretty sharp for both of them. F9, both of them are pretty sharp. It's where when you get down to the 1.8 and then obviously 1.2 where the G-Master excels in terms of sharpness. Pretty comparable for both lenses. You can see it's a little bit more telephoto on the Zeiss here though. And then now we're going to look at focus breathing. So this is the G-Master at 2.8. You can see a decent amount of focus breathing. You can look at the color checker there at the edge. And here's the Zeiss. I'd say slightly more, maybe about 10%, but I'd say they're pretty even. And this was also at 2.8. And just a quicker autofocus test to see that focus breathing, which both have a considerable amount of for sure. And here's a focus speed test at 1.8. Here's the G-Master. Nice, smooth. But the Zeiss is actually faster in this case, which was the case in my other G-Master test as well. For fun, here's f1.2 to 1.8 on the Zeiss, just to show the difference here. And here is a focus distance check. This is the G-Master. And then here is the Zeiss. So I'd say about 25% closer focus for the G-Master wins here. And then we want to check how these lenses control light and flares coming into the lens. I'd say they both do a considerably good job. No big issues here. I shone a light right into the lenses and didn't see too much flaring going on other than what you would expect. So I'd say a tie there. Last but not least, we have Bokeh. So this is at 2.8 for the G-Master. Now these were slightly different kind of distances, given that the Zeiss is telephoto. So it's going to look a little bit bigger here with the Bokeh, but we're looking for smoothness and we're looking for kind of that oniony effect, which you could see a little bit in the Zeiss here, not too much, but you can definitely see that it's smoother as we stop down. Here we are at f2. You can see all the Bokeh here is round, and it's round on the Zeiss too, but you can start to see a little bit of onioning going on near the edges. And here we are zoomed in to 350%, both at f2. Both pretty good, I'd say. Pretty equal so far. Here we are at 1.8. Can still see very round Bokeh here for the G-Master. But when we go over to the Zeiss, now we can start seeing a little bit of that ovally shape, especially towards the edges and those yellows there. As we can compare them side to side. Again, the zooming and the focal length is going to make a difference here in terms of the size of the Bokeh. And just for fun, we'll look at 1.2. This is where the G-Master does definitely not keep its round shape on the Bokeh, but that's to be expected. And here's all the G-Masters at 2.8, f2, and f1.8. And then there's your Zeiss, as you can see, not as round clearly in these tests here. And then there's f1.2 for fun again for the G-Master. So what do you think? Did you notice a difference? Now, I got the 55mm 1.8 back in 2014 when it first came out, and for the last 7 years, it has easily been my most used lens. Its compact size and the image quality made it my go-to lens for pretty much all talking head videos and corporate video shoots. But there were a few things that frustrated me. Number one, the 55mm focal length being a little bit more telephoto than 50mm. This made framing indoors slightly more difficult. And number two, the fly-by-wire focusing, which made it very hard to get repeatable, smooth results when manually focusing. And then finally, number three, the fact that it only went to 1.8, which is just not good enough in my opinion for a 50mm prime. I mean, heck, the nifty 50 from Canon back in the day was around $100 and that went to 1.8, and this is a $1,000 lens. Now, of course, the reason for this was to keep the size of the lens down, given that they were just launching this new full-frame E-mount lineup of cameras with the A7 mirrorless cameras. And one of the priorities for Sony was to clearly keep everything in a small form factor, but still 1.8 just doesn't cut it for a 50mm prime in my opinion. So for me, the 50mm 1.2 G-Master covers all of these deficiencies of the 55mm that I just expressed. But let's take a look at where the GM excelled in other areas of the Zeiss. Now, number one, speed. Obviously, it's a full stop brighter than the Zeiss. The Bokeh was also slightly smoother and rounder than the Zeiss, certainly at 1.8. And number three, it was ever so slightly sharper than the Zeiss, especially at 1.8, and there was also reduced vignetting at the lower f-stops. Also, the focus is accurate and repeatable, unlike the fly-by-wire that you get with the Zeiss. There's also physical buttons, customizable buttons, and an aperture ring. And then finally, number six, the 50mm frame versus the 55mm frame, which is just slightly more telephoto that you get with the Zeiss. I definitely prefer to have it to be exactly 50. Now, both lenses struggled with focus breathing, which I was surprised by, but I guess I've been managing with the Zeiss for all these years, so then at least the Sony GM, which I knew would have issues with focus breathing based on other reviews, won't be too much worse. Now, the Zeiss still does excel in a few areas compared to the G-Master. Number one, size and weight. The GM is twice as large and about 3 times heavier at 1.7 pounds. And number two, the Zeiss also has much faster autofocus. This seems to be the case with all the Sony Zeiss lenses that I've tested versus the G-Master equivalents. However, the GM beats the Zeiss in minimal focus distance by about 25%. Also, the GM has a much more standard front filter of about 72mm versus the 49mm you get with the Zeiss. Now let's talk price. The GM is $1,100 more expensive, brand new, than the Zeiss. But at this point, you can probably get the Zeiss for much cheaper used. It's currently selling new for $900, but I recently sold mine for $600, so I'm sure you can get one in the $500 to $600 range, making this lens, at least brand new, about 3 to 4 times more expensive. But if you're like me, then the advantages you get with this G-Master, especially the 1.2 aperture, the accurate and repeatable manual focus, then this extra cost is likely going to be worth it for you, especially considering that this will likely remain my most used lens for video. In fact, I'm probably done buying lenses for now. I've got the 16 to 200 millimeter focal length covered with my Sony GM zoom lenses, which are all f2.8. And then I have my primes, my 24, 35, my 50, and my 85, which are all 1.4, with the exception of this 50, which is 1.2. And then I do have that 90 millimeter macro lens at 2.8 from Sony as well. I'm going to be doing a product photography video, by the way, with that lens in the coming months, so make sure you're subscribed for that. The only other lenses I've considered are the 135 millimeter 1.8 from Sony, which is a great photography and portrait lens, as well as the new Sony 14 millimeter 1.8 G-Master lens, which is going to be really great for astrophotography. But those are just so niche for me at this point, so I think I'm good on lenses for now, actually. Now, if you're interested in the Sony 50mm 1.2 lens or any of the other ones I mentioned in this video, click the links in the description below. Buying through my links helps to support the channel so I can make more videos like this one, and I really do appreciate it. But that's it for this video. Leave any questions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to respond there. Let me know what you thought about this lens. Are you going to grab it? Are you going to go for this one? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can do so by clicking the button on screen. And for more information about the Sony 50mm 1.2 G-Master as well as other Sony lenses, check out my blog over on my website at filmin5d.com. Thanks again for watching.